So thank you guys. So I'm going to, it's nerve-wracking to have a crowd that's like partially academic and partially not. So I'll try and cut right down the middle and make everybody slightly unhappy. So what I want to talk about today is about crowds. And I'm going to use crowdfunding to talk about it. I'm going to talk about a bunch of research projects that have yielded results, some of which are papers, some of which aren't. And what I really think about is, we're all here talking about crowds, and the fundamental questions that I keep hearing asked over and over again is, why are crowds good? What makes them good? Right? And I think some of us have in the back of our mind this sort of wisdom of crowds idea, right? James Surowiecki. Now, I think this is great, and I think crowds are often wise, but there's another sort of crowds title that came out 150 years before called The Madness of Crowds, right? And so just as we have examples of crowds being wise and smart, we have lots of examples of crowds turning into witch hunts or into tulip buying markets or bubbles. So what is it? I mean, what makes a crowd wise or mad? When is it wise or mad? Especially in crowdfunding, right? And in crowdsourcing and all these other things. So I want to present 3 studies I've done with 3 separate people that talk about when crowds are wise and when they're mad, and kind of give you the results we have so far. So I'm going to talk first about when we compare crowds to experts, who sort of ends up on top. I'm going to talk about crowds and discrimination, and then I'll talk a bit about the long-term success of crowdfunding and some of the follow-up data we have. And all this data is derived from Kickstarter plus other things, and I'll explain as I go along. So let me talk about crowds and experts. So there was a big deal in 2012, which was the first year that Kickstarter started giving more money to the arts than the National Endowment of the Arts did. Right? So Kickstarter is now a bigger funder of the arts than the NEA is. So big question there. What do we gain and what do we lose by moving from purely expert-based to crowd-based? Right? And so with Raman Ananda at Harvard Business School, we set out to answer that question. So we got together a group of judges who were NEA judges or judges of other top grant competitions. And we put together judging criteria based on the NEA criteria. So judging projects based on artistic value, based on community impact, based on innovation, based on feasibility, a whole range of different scales. And then we had those people judge Kickstarter projects without knowing what the outcomes were. And we had them do 120 different Kickstarter projects, and each one saw the same combination of big successes, big failures, and places somewhere in between. And then we actually also followed up with all those Kickstarter projects to find out what happened later, right? So not just did they fail or succeed, but what were the long-term outcomes? And so this is what we found. The crowd and experts actually agreed about 60% of the time. And so the projects that were most funded by the crowd were also the ones most liked by experts. So these 2 curves here, the dotted line curve is the average score assigned by the judges to projects that succeeded on Kickstarter. The solid line are the projects that failed on Kickstarter, right? And you can see there's a pretty distinct difference, right? 60% overlap in an area like theater, right? Which is an area where you'd expect there to be a lot of subjectivity and where there's a lot of research showing there's a pretty big gap between what expert cultural opinion is and what critics say and what crowd or market says. So the fact that you have that kind of overlap suggests there's something interesting there. Now, we also looked at the edge cases, the cases where people didn't agree, right? And 75% of the time when there wasn't agreement, it was because the crowds funded something that experts wouldn't fund, okay? 25% of the time the experts funded something the crowd wouldn't. We can't say much about what happened with the ones that the expert funded, except to say there's still room for experts, especially funding larger projects and so on. But in terms of funding, what happened to projects funded by the crowd versus projects funded by the crowd and experts, we actually can't find much difference. So we tracked what happened with all of these. There's some suggestion that the projects that were liked by both the crowd and the experts, right, that were mutually agreed on, were sort of low-risk projects. Almost all of them ended up being successful, within different bounds of success. So they all premiered. None of them failed to put their play together or their musical or something similar. Some of them got reviewed by the New York Times. Some of them went on to sell quite a few tickets. Interestingly, on the ones that just the crowd funded, there seemed to be more variation. So of those, 2 of them turned out to be hits. One of the ones the experts hated ended up having a very successful off-Broadway run. Another one the experts didn't like ended up winning several New York Theater Innovation Awards. And there were also a couple that were abject failures, including one where the review read, this was a New York Times review, I tried to think of something I liked about the play when I was leaving, and I realized that the graphic design on the posters was quite nice, right? So there were some failures too, which I think points to the idea that the crowd and experts generally agree, and perhaps what the crowd is actually doing is lowering the barrier to entry somewhat, in a good way, right? Not just randomly, because we followed these people up. Quite a few of them were funded by friends and family. All the usual things you'd expect would cause problems here didn't seem to, right? So a lot of agreement between crowds and experts. So to that extent, there seems to be some wisdom in the crowd, right? And when we do a direct comparison, and even this difficult case of theater, right? So that's one example. Let me talk about a second case. So, a few more examples. So I've done some studies looking specifically at the sort of more VC-ish world of crowdfunding. So projects like Kickstarter in the technology, design, video game space. And trying to understand, are the signals that the crowd's responding to rational or not? So went through a whole bunch of projects, 1,200 projects, and had a whole bunch of people go through them as RAs and code them about whether or not they showed signs of endorsements from third parties, right? Did it have TechCrunch loves my product, right? Did they have a team with experience that had done this before? Had they produced a prototype? Did they have detailed plans? Did they have a lack of spelling errors? Right? It turns out a spelling error decreases your chance of success by 13%, all other things being equal. Did they provide frequent updates to their crowd, right? Something anyone else recommends. And I thought I'd also look for some signals that were sort of orthogonal of quality, right? That would be strong signals, but wouldn't necessarily indicate a product that was going to succeed. And in those cases, I thought, okay, let's figure out what does the internet like that doesn't make sense. They like cat videos. They like bacon. So we looked for people mentioning bacon or having cat videos. We thought about in-group identity. People self-identified as geeks or nerds. And then pop culture, Star Wars, Star Trek, My Little Pony, a whole list of other top television programs and so on. And what we found is universally, the signals of quality seem to predict success in crowdfunding campaigns. And the signals of orthogonal quality, with the exception of calling yourself a geek, which seemed to help, didn't. So all of this evidence seems to point out that the crowd is reasonably rational in terms of how it's thinking about assessing a product quality. So it's not that people are just herding or stampeding. There's other things going on, and there seems to be some rationality, more wisdom than madness. Right? And now, we tend to compare ourselves to experts and say, okay, experts really know what they're doing. Venture capitalists, for example, are experts in funding companies. But there's biases associated with experts too. And particularly in the case of VC and funding of companies, one of the more famous of these is a bias, a gender bias. All right, so this is work with Jason Greenberg here at NYU, go NYU. There's a lot of evidence that's really depressing showing bias against women raising capital. So women make up 40% of all business owners in the United States. They make up 1.3% of founders of VC-backed companies, right? That's a huge, huge gap. Now, what the cause of that gap is many different things, right? There is the idea that there's already an old boys network that they can't plug into. Women tend to start different kinds of companies than men. There's also clearly misogyny going on. There's a lot of factors mixed together, right? So what we wanted to figure out is the crowd, will that do better, right? What happens with discrimination in the crowd? So we looked at 1,200 projects and 250,000 backers to try and figure out what was going on here. And we chose them from different categories, right? We chose them from categories where women were more prevalent. In this case, it was fashion and fashion startups and children's books. So we chose areas where women were much less prevalent, like video games and technology, and somewhere in the middle, like film. And here's what we found, right? The blue line are female-only projects. The red line is the overall average, and the tan line in the middle is male-only projects. Right? So what you find here is actually the biggest gap where women are most successful is in technology. All other things being equal, female-led projects, these are projects raising over $5,000, so larger projects. Female-led projects succeeded over 40% of the time. Male-led projects succeeded over 20%. So this seemed kind of baffling to us, right? Which is this. Say that again, that stat. So female-led projects in technology succeeded over 40% of the time. Male-led projects in technology succeeded just over 20%. There were many fewer female projects, but they were much more successful, right? And this is controlling for, when you control for all the factors in place, women are on average 13% more likely to succeed than men on the margin, with everything else being equal.
Success here is getting funded, yeah.
Getting funded, yep. So this is not long-term, okay? So the question becomes why, right? And especially why is it at the area we'd least expect to see this happen? Technology, where women are most underrepresented. They make up the smallest proportion of backers there and the smallest proportion of projects. And so we decided to actually do an experiment to figure this out. So what we did was we took one of the most popular technology projects on Kickstarter and one of the most popular fashion projects, was showing you one of these. And we randomized for a whole group of experimental subjects who created the project. We took this picture of women and men, and believe it or not, neuroscientists have found these are people equally attractive individuals, apparently. This is based on, there's an attractiveness scale. And we used the names, the most common millennial names of Jessica and Michael. So Jessica and Michael Smith. And all that varied between these projects was whether you saw Jessica Smith or Michael Smith, right? Otherwise, the projects were exactly identical. And what we found was, just like we had found before, men didn't seem to care. So there wasn't a bias for men or against women from male backers. And in general, there wasn't a huge female effect, except for women who identified themselves as activists. That is, women who cared that you should support other women and that believed that women were being underrepresented in technology. Those people were driving almost this entire effect, right? So it turned out that the activist women were able to get around the gatekeepers that had been holding them back. It wasn't just about representation. It was about people actually stepping up and saying, I want to support these people for reasons that matter to me, which I think matches nicely with what our last speaker found. And that was the reason why women were being more successful than men on Kickstarter. So I think there's something really interesting here about the democratization and the many reasons why people do crowdfunding. And it's not just about representation. It's not just about having more women. It's about having women who are actually actively helping each other. And that seemed to actually explain what's going on. How much time do you have left? A minute? 5 minutes. OK, so I'll give you one more set of things. So this is on the long-term impact of crowdfunding. And this is based on follow-up studies we did of what happened to projects a year or two after they came out. So we surveyed everybody who had made a successful project in technology, video games, or design. Again, the more kind of product-focused things. We have some for film and theater too. I won't present those here. And we asked them a lot of questions. Among the things that turned out to be really interesting was of the projects that answered, and we had a very high response rate and no biases we could find, 90% of them were turned into ongoing ventures. Right? Doesn't mean it was full time. 90% of them were still going on. And of those, 33%, almost a third of them, reported yearly revenues of over $100,000 from their campaign. Right? And this is after not counting additional crowdfunding money. What was also interesting, I think that we heard about the same thing from Indiegogo a few minutes ago, is that it turns out that raising money was sort of the fourth most popular benefit of crowdfunding. So this is based on, this is none, a little, some, a lot, the various benefits of crowdfunding. And so the people we surveyed found that developing a customer base was actually more critical than raising money in many cases. Getting press attention was more important. And some people, quite a few of them, did raise additional funds. I'll have to look at the exact numbers. All of this is online, and you can check my paper on it. But there were a huge amount of benefits to people other than just raising capital. Right? And crowdfunding really unlocked those benefits for people. We also talked about sort of fraud and delivery rates before. So we actually tracked when projects actually delivered. And it turns out that about 75% of projects are late. And the more money you raise, the later you are. So these are the delivery curves, right? And it shows you the percentage of delivery months after promised delivery. Now, as I said earlier, for those of you who are here, we found actual instances of fraud were very rare. So something, and this is Kickstarter, I can't talk about other platforms, but it was about 3.5% of the projects we found seemed to show signs of fraud. Doesn't mean they're fraudulent, the person could have died. Honestly, we don't know, right? But they stopped responding on email, people were complaining about it, and there was really no trace of the project. But that represented less than 0.5% of the total money spent, right? So fraud was actually really rare comparatively, and it'd be interesting to talk a little bit more about why that is at some future point.
It's too early, they'll come, believe me.
So we could talk about that, but there's been a lot of, we've seen a lot of cases of attempted fraud, and we've seen why they've stopped. So you know, fraudsters always come. There's advantages to being part of a community, though, and stopping that. Okay, and then last thing, and this, don't worry, you don't have to memorize this chart, and I have this posted up. But one of the things that becomes interesting for those of you who are kind of practitioners is there's all this research, both for me and other people, have sort of been looking at when do you get benefits from crowdfunding, what helps, right? So it turns out that to run a successful campaign, it helps for you to have the right background, to have the right endorsements. In other words, to do all the things you'd expect someone who's actually going to deliver a project to actually do. The more money you're looking to raise, generally the worse that you do. We didn't find much effect of having a business plan in advance, having a clear sort of plan, but being able to broadcast what you were doing and why you were the right person helped. In getting more money after Kickstarter, it helped, or after a crowdfunding campaign, it helped to have raised a lot of money, which I think is what we just heard in the last talk, right? The more successful you were, more likely you were to get follow-on money. And then business plans actually helped. So if you had a business plan, you're more likely to raise cash. And then getting additional benefits from the campaign, again, the more successful you are, the more benefits that you tended to get, and the more you were the right kind of people to execute in any kind of environment, the better you'd do. And then in terms of delivery, The only thing that helps is having a really clear schedule up front. And the more money you raise, the bigger your goal, the more likely you are to be delayed, right? For all the reasons of complexity and everything else. So, you know, I kind of feel a little bad as an academic that I keep finding good news for crowdfunding. I'm looking, you know, I feel like I'm feeling like I was shill at this point, right? Because I'm expecting to find more kind of qualifications that the crowd is actually insane at points. So far, I've had trouble doing that, right? Most of the indications I have is that the crowd is wise within certain boundaries, right? And this is in Kickstarter, which has this past the post kind of approach and a few other angles to it. But by and large, the evidence seems to be that the crowd seems to be wiser than it is mad, which is interesting because it could have gone either way. There's no reason to suspect that markets work in these kind of cases. But that having the right kind of mix of dynamics and a large population helps. So if you have a much less looked at site, there's a good chance you'll see much more fraud and much less success. And I'd love to talk about any of this stuff further. I've got papers online you want to look at, comments, objection, and any of you who actually run crowdfunding sites who'd like to give up data or do experiments, I'm happy to talk about that as well. So thank you guys a lot.